Today, author Baynard Woods lives in Baltimore, Maryland, but go back to his childhood and he grew up in South Carolina. Woods comes from a long line of Southerners with a rich, rooted history, but not all of these stories are something he's proud about. As a child, he learned several disturbing facts about his ancestors, one being that he was a descendant of Southern slavers who had bought hundreds of enslaved people before the end of the Civil War in 1865. He had also heard anecdotes about his great-grandfather who had taken part in the racial killing of a politician. This relative had been involved in the lynching of an African-American man named Peter J. Lemon, who was a county commissioner in South Carolina in 1871. While Woods was privy to this darker side of his family's history, rarely did he, as a young person, have deeper conversations about racism and discrimination in America. His own parents lived in an era where segregation was just another norm.
My parents grew up going to segregated schools. And then I started to realize that every door they ever walked through in public said white or whites only above it. But by my lifetime, they didn't speak about it. Whiteness was something we didn't talk about. So I wanted to figure out why that was and how that worked and how it's like, oh, we don't see race anymore, even though that was the only thing we saw for most of our life.
It wasn't until he was a teenager that Woods began to recognize how important it is to look back on this time in U.S. history. While it's difficult and uncomfortable at times to do so, it helped him gain a firmer understanding of how the past intersects with the present.
The same way my parents quit talking about whiteness after the Civil Rights Act, I felt like many people of my generation or of this period will talk about structural racism as a way almost to absolve themselves. On the one hand, oh, look, I know this stuff and I'm talking about racism. On the other hand, I can't really do anything about it. It's just everywhere. It's universal and it's built into our system. And so I'm going to go about my business. And I thought it was important to see how the cover-up of my great-grandfather's crimes and all of the massive crimes that had preceded it, believing that you owned and torturing thousands and thousands of people over the course of 300 years, how the cover-up of those crimes had created the world that I inhabited and the way that I thought and the sense of myself and the way I'd seen myself. And so, instead of structural racism, I thought we needed to look at how it intersected with where we live, with who we love, and with the people that we care most about.
By unearthing this difficult history, it helped Woods better understand the privileges he grew up with as a young white person living in the South. He never had to worry about being racially profiled or unfairly stereotyped while going about everyday tasks, like driving or shopping at a store. He believes many Americans are aware of the racism and inequality still present in the U.S., but it's difficult to understand the gravity of these experiences unless you're in someone else's shoes. Woods says one step in the right direction is to really think about the advantages you may have that others may not.
I believe that acknowledging it is the first thing, that when we're in this mode of saying, I just don't see whiteness, we're never going to dismantle it. The way I tried to explain it to my mom was it's as if we started a basketball game where one side had shoes and the other side didn't have shoes. And then you forbid talking about shoes. And that's essentially what we see with the banning of CRT in various states, critical race theory in quotes. And the backlash to the 1619 Project is white people do not want to talk about whiteness at all. We're desperately afraid of talking about whiteness. And so that shows me that there's some power in talking about it.
But not everyone believes that talking about inequality will change anything at all. Dr. David Canton is the Director of African American Studies at the University of Florida and an Associate Professor of History within the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the university. He says conversations like these are important, but are not enough. After these discussions, people must come together and demand action in the form of public policy.
No president has woke up and said, you know what, we're going to pass policies to help African Americans. It just never happens. Only times there's change is when there's protests from the ground. People are protesting, they're voting, making their voice heard. Then the government responds with policies to help make changes.
A prime example of this is the passing of the Civil Rights Act. In April 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King wrote a long letter to his fellow clergymen from his jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. He had been arrested and jailed following anti-segregation protests in the area. King wrote, "Injustice must be exposed to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured." As a result of his work and the mass protests of the civil rights movement during the 1960s, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson and prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. While this act led to formal protections, many of these implicit biases still exist today. Canton believes we'll make progress not by exposing privilege, but by adopting policies that specifically target systemic inequality. One example is passing policies that help to reduce Black maternal mortality rates in healthcare. Black women are currently 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Even if you hold for class, Black middle-class women who are pregnant, taking prenatal pills, they have health care, they see their doctor, their baby still have a double chance of dying. And now they're saying it's because of racism and sexism. If we look at housing, 75% of whites own homes. I think for African Americans, 40%. In fact, it's been 40% for the last 50 years. That's structural inequality. And we can go on and on with the statistics. So I think when you look at institutional racism that way with the data, the other reason why we should use data, this whole notion that white people are falling behind, the data doesn't show it. Even though there has been a Black president, there's some Black billionaires, you see some Black successful people, when you look at the data says a different story. So I think oftentimes we put a lot into these conversations, but racism is about systemic inequality and power. And we don't want to have those conversations, right? We want to have it as a feel good, I have a Black friend, I'm married to a Black person, rather than looking at these are about systems of inequality and power inequity between whites and African Americans.
For Woods, part of this process also includes looking back at the wrongs of the past and trying to make reparations for the acts of his ancestors. For one, he spearheaded an effort to erect a historical marker in Peter J. Lemon's name at the location where the Southern politician was murdered. Woods is also raising funds to buy a tombstone for Lemon's unmarked grave.
These are just starts of things to do, and we really need reparations ultimately on a federal level and a personal level, but we can't wait for the federal government.
It's key to take action by stepping outside of your daily bubble. Have those difficult conversations about the privileges you may have and others don't. Seek out groups that are focused on furthering equality and opportunities for all. A couple notable organizations to learn more about are the ACLU, the NAACP, and the Advancement Project. To find out more about this topic, these resources, and our guests, Baynard Woods and Dr. David Canton, visit viewpointsradio.org. Also check out Woods' book, Inheritance, an autobiography of whiteness, available online now and in bookstores. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Polly Henson. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
You thought that a particular child was going to break down in tears because they really were very close to Grandpapa. But it turns out that they just look at you, kind of mute, and then say, "Can we have mac and cheese for lunch?"
The difficult conversations we have in life. Then,
athletes, for sure, like at a Power 5 conference school where they are known, they probably want to maintain a certain image and they don't want to appear weak.
Understanding the mental illness epidemic that's plaguing collegiate sports teams. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.